Ken Kesey came from a small town in Oregon, but he wrote books that dazzled the literary world.
You know, how many people write a book as good as Cuckoo's Nest, or as good as Sometimes a Great Notion?
He commanded a legendary bus trip and hearkened a new age of popular culture.
Because God knows we ought to be able to decide what our state of mind is.
Kesey became quite famous, but I think the fame was something that he was very ambivalent about.
He lived his later years as one of Oregon's best-known authors and one of the country's most visible icons of the psychedelic 60s.
The 60s ain't over till the fat lady gets high.
Stand a while in the spotlight. Never forget it. You're suddenly elevated and alone.
Funding for Oregon Experience is provided by the Robert D. and Marcia H. Randall Fund for Lifelong Learning, the Oregon Cultural Trust, the Clark Foundation, additional support provided by the Roundhouse Foundation, and viewers like you. Thank you.
In the summer of 1964, Ken Kesey and friends took a drug-enhanced trip from California to New York. Further would become the best-known bus in history. And the travelers, who called themselves the Band of Merry Pranksters, filmed the whole thing. Decades later, Kesey and some of those same pranksters would still be editing that footage.
Gotta hit that one. There you go. And that one.
The bus would live on, longer than anyone would have expected. Kesey often said that his best work was the bus, but some people might disagree. Because Ken Kesey could write. He had a gift.
He's an extraordinary writer. There is a kind of luminous quality to his writing that even very good writers don't have.
The woman stands watching, thin burred hand resting on the shoulder of her 12-year-old son, who leans against her hip, polishing his eyeglasses with the hem of her canary yellow skirt. The colors strike with stinging clarity, cutting the scene deep. Blue sky, white clouds, blue water, white petals floating, and that sparkling patch of yellow.
Kesey authored or co-authored 5 novels and at least that many other books. He wrote essays and magazine articles, stage plays, and children's stories.
Kesey wrote at least 2 books that have been in print ever since they've come out and are widely read. That is an extraordinary achievement. But maybe Kesey did not conceive of having a career as a writer as being the most important thing that he could do.
He was different from the beginning. He had a mind of his own. He was always interesting. He was always full of life.
Kesey's mother, Geneva, grew up in Arkansas. His father, Fred, came from Texas.
Fred ended up with a job making cheese in a creamery. And that's how we ended up in the creamery business.
Ken and his younger brother, Chuck, were born in Colorado. After the war, the family moved to Springfield, Oregon, where Fred would manage a local creamery cooperative. From early on, Ken liked to be on stage. He and Chuck put together a magic act.
They did a lot of magic. They appeared at schools, at the McDonald Theater on Saturday morning at matinees. He would hypnotize Chuck.
Young Ken learned ventriloquism. He loved school drama class.
He himself wanted to be an actor, and his writing was primarily to write parts for himself.
He did plays all the way through high school. He was the lead character in all these, and he would dress up, and he liked that showmanship, and that's what he did in college.
He excelled at sports.
His dad had a rule, which was you had to do a sport or two, and boxing was his dad's first choice. Dad did not like boxing at all.
Ken Kesey wrestled. He held the wrestling team record for most wins at the University of Oregon. He competed for an alternate spot on the 1960 Olympic team, but an injury held him back. He majored in speech and communication at the U of O, and he married Faye Haxby during their junior year.
Faye was Ken's sweetheart from high school. Faye really made Ken able to do a lot of the crazy stuff that he did, because she kept everything going.
I understood him, and I could tell there weren't very many other people who did at that time. And we liked the same things. We had somewhat the same values. She just fit my idea of what a mate should be.
Ken Kesey graduated from the University of Oregon in 1957, but he spent a year in Hollywood going to be possibly a movie actor.
Kesey's efforts to break into Hollywood fell short. He applied for financial help, a fellowship, to go to graduate school in California.
A couple of short stories won me a Woodrow Wilson to the famous Wallace Stegner writing class at Stanford. Professor Stegner mistook me, I fear, for an anti-intellectual, not understanding that I was in fact something far less presupposing, a near illiterate, especially compared to the rest of his blue chip roster. There was Peter Beagle, A Fine and Private Place, The Last Unicorn, Robert Stone, A Hall of Mirrors, Dog Soldiers, Wendell-Berry, Ed McClanahan, and Gurney Norman, Ken Babbs, and Larry McMurtry. There were others, but you get the idea. A hell of a team.
Kesey needed a new writing project for the class, and he didn't have to wait long for inspiration.
Kesey went to what we would now call clinical drug trials, in which he was paid money to take various substances that were not known to him. And then he was in a room and his blood pressure was monitored, his urine was taken, his temperature was monitored, there were notes taken as to his reactions.
A research team at the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital paid Kesey and the other volunteers $25 per visit. The unidentified drugs they would test included LSD, psilocybin, and other powerful hallucinogens.
What happened was they found out that sometimes they got a drug that really was good. And they liked it a lot, and so they got together afterwards and they said, when we get that, let's tell them it's nothing. Nothing's going on or anything, because if there's nothing going on, they let you out. So there they'd be, out in the streets, and having a good time.
But these were not simple party drugs to Kesey and his friends. They believed there was life-changing potential in these pills.
As you go through life, you are imprinted with so much stuff put into you from everywhere. Your teachers, your parents, your friends, television, radio, everything is coming to you all the time. It's imprinting you. until finally there's nothing else coming in and you are this fixed thing with no new thoughts, no new attitudes, nothing. And then you take a little bit of LSD and boom, it's all gone, and now coming in is all kinds of information you didn't know about, all kinds of truths you didn't know about.
As the clinical tests wound down, Kesey got a job at the same hospital on the ward for psychiatric patients.
And we needed money. Shannon had been born, and so he took a job as an orderly, working at night, and he had enough downtime during the night that he started writing.
He wrote some really good stuff about that, about how these people are really disturbed. He says, it's hell being crazy. He himself would take LSD to look through that lens at life.
Harding looks around, sees everybody watching him, and he does his best to laugh. A sound comes out of his mouth like a nail being crowbarred out of a plank of green pine. He can't stop it. He wrings his hands like a fly and clenches his eyes at the awful sound of that squeaking. But he can't stop it. It gets higher and higher until finally, with a suck-up breath, he lets his face fall into his waiting hands.
His exposure to himself during those drug experiments and him working in an insane asylum or whatever it was called, I think that exposed him to the amazing spectrum of human experience.
Through Kesey and others, some of those psychedelic drugs were finding their way outside the hospital, and ever more people began to experiment with them.
They just sent you into ecstasy. They send you off into a new world. But he didn't ever suggest I try it.
I did try it some. I felt like if Ken was taking some, I ought to see what's happening, and especially when we didn't think about it as a drug or anything illegal, and it wasn't illegal at that time. I found it a very kind of good experience. It gave me insights into things that I would never have experienced, but I certainly wouldn't want to take it on and on.
One night in 1960, while at work at the hospital, Kesey had a drug-induced vision. He began to write about a fictional mental ward, as seen through the eyes of a patient, a Native American.
The first 3 pages of Cuckoo's Nest are written on peyote.
The narrator suffers from paranoia and hallucinations. In the opening lines, he describes the African American orderlies.
They're out there. Black boys in white suits up before me to commit sex acts in the hall and get it mopped up before I can catch them. That Indian persona that comes through there, that's the thing that keeps that book from just being a melodrama. They're mopping when I come out of the dorm. All 3 of them, sulky, hating everything. The time of the day, the place they're at, the people they got to work around.
Kesey observed and sketched many patients at the hospital, but he said that the characters in his book are purely fictional. He set the story in Oregon, in a place much like this, the State Hospital in Salem. He and Faye had visited here years earlier for a high school project. The story's narrator, 6'7" Chief Broom, never spoke to the other patients and pretended not to hear.
When they hate like this, it's better if they don't see me. I creep along the wall, quiet as dust in my canvas shoes. But they got special sensitive equipment that detects my fear, and they all look up, all 3 at once. Eyes glittering out of the black faces like the hard glitter of radio tubes out of the back of an old radio. That character came to me full blown. I can't help but think that that character, that spirit, was waiting for somebody to open the door so it could speak through.
He would go through and make corrections and write all over it until he couldn't have room to write anymore, and then he would have me type another clean copy and he would start over.
Kesey named the book after a children's rhyme his grandmother had taught him, one that he would recite on stage to audiences for many years to come.
William, William, tremble toes. He's a good fisherman. Catches hens, puts them in the pens. Wire, blyer, limber lock.
3 geese in the flock. One flew east, one flew west.
One flew over the cuckoo's nest.
I think Cuckoo's Nest was important because, first of all, it broke new ground. This incomprehensible mashup of sanity, insanity, drug-induced states, and this narrator, this extraordinary point of view, I think is what really caught people's interest.
In this story, the big nurse rules the roost. Her authority is challenged by a rebellious newcomer, Randall McMurphy, whom Kesey modeled after himself. Chief Broom recalls his first meeting with McMurphy, a barroom brawler who liked to gamble.
I remember real clear the way that hand looked. There was carbon under the fingernails where he'd worked once in a garage. There was a dirty Band-Aid on the middle knuckle, peeling up at the edge. All the rest of the knuckles were covered with scars and cuts, old and new. I remember the palm was smooth and hard as bone from hefting the wooden handles of axes and hoes. Not the hand you think could deal cards.
Ultimately, all the patients and staff find themselves at the mercy of the system itself, what the chief calls the combine.
And a nut house turns out to be a great metaphor for right then, for early 60s. We were living in the nut house of the great American dream of better and bigger and stronger and faster and more potent. And that book is about power. Who has it and who doesn't have it?
One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest became an international bestseller. The book's unflattering portrayal of patient treatment and electroshock therapy helped change the way hospitals treat the mentally ill.
Some of the things that are outstanding.
The Veterans Hospital drug study was later revealed to have been a project of the CIA. The spy agency had paid test subjects to try psychedelic drugs. It expected to find a new kind of chemical weapon. But Ken Kesey and his friends had discovered what they thought was a better use. The summer of 1962 found the Kesey family back up in Oregon, living in a small cabin in coastal Lane County. Timber country. Ken was researching his next book.
At that time, Oregon had the highest suicide rate along the coast there of any place in the nation. And that really intrigued Ken, and he thought about the rain and the fog and the way the ocean is, always there, always pounding, the way the river, all these things work together, and wondered what that had to do with suicide, if anything, which was what got him kind of interested in that area. The story grew out of that.
Just Faye and I and the 2 kids. And I would go into Florence, the history museum there, and pick up a few old books, and I'd come back out and read them. They're mostly diaries of people. And you'd be there with this lantern light going on and the sound of the waves, and you realize, man, it's still just like that.
He learned all he could about the local industry, logging.
Some people we knew that had the logging business, and they took him in, and he went to work with them and listened to them, heard them talk, and heard them play, and heard them pray, or whatever they did. So that's mainly how he got into the logging.
The result, published in 1964, would be Ken Kesey's tour de force. Sometimes a great notion, a rich, nuanced story of a troubled logging family, told through an array of different voices.
That book is an experiment in narration. It's a long sucker. It's 600 pages in some. But it's an incredible American novel experiment.
He and his family moved into a rustic, remote house in La Honda, California. Kesey wrote out hundreds of pages of plot notes, character studies, and nitpicking details. He named the book, which does reference suicide, from the lyrics of a folk song, "Goodnight, Irene."
Along the western slopes of the Oregon coastal range, come look, the hysterical crashing of tributaries as they merge into the Wakanda-Alga River.
Sometimes a great notion starts out with water. It's about water. It's about water in the river, water in the rain, water soaked up in the ground.
The first little washes flashing like thick rushing winds through sheep sorrel and clover, ghost fern and nettle, shearing, cutting, forming branches.
At the pure sentence level, where images come from and how sentences are concocted, you can tell when you're in the presence of a good writer. And I think that's what you find in Kesey. You find very intelligent writing. You can pick it up anywhere and start reading, and you get this sense of somebody carefully made this complicated thing.
The forest fought against the attack on its age-old domain with all the age-old weapons nature could muster. Blackberries strung out barbed barricades. The wind shook widowmakers crashing down from high-rotted snags. And in the tops of huge trees, the very rain seemed to work at fixing the trees standing, threading the million green needles in an attempt to stitch the trees upright against the sky. But the trees continued to fall, gasping long sighs of clumping against the spongy earth, to be trimmed and bucked into logs, to be coaxed and cajoled downhill into the river with unflagging regularity, in spite of all nature could do to stop it.
The novel delves into the complicated dynamics within the Stamper family and into the family's bitter conflict with the rest of the community.
Great Notion is truly his masterpiece. He spent a year of, away from the family, working his butt off. It took a lot out of him.
When the book was finished and ready for the publisher, Kesey himself was ready for something completely different. He bought a bus.
Bing bang bong, bing bang ba bong, bing bang bong, bing.
With money from the two books, Faye and Ken purchased a 1939 school bus. The previous owners had put in beds and a cooking area. Kesey and friends would add some color.
I can remember painting a bus out in the yard when you're 3, maybe 4 years old. It seems like the most obvious thing in the world to be out there doing. Grab some paint and put it on there.
Kesey's friend, Ken Babbs, had left the Stanford writing program for a stint in the Marines.
I was in the Marine Corps until May of 1964. I'd been in Vietnam in 62 and 63 flying helicopters.
When Babbs then was coming home from Vietnam, Ken thought, well, we need to reorient him after he's been gone. Let's go on a trip across the United States.
Kesey had written and was coming out that summer, Sometimes a Great Notion. There was going to be a big party in New York, a coming out party, and also the World's Fair was there.
Kesey decided to film the trip.
Taking a bunch of people across the country, that's boring to him. Now, if you get some cameras, you get some costumes, you get some characters, and you head out across the country, now all of a sudden that gets really interesting.
We're going to make a movie of this bus trip. And this will be a movie that has never been made before. It'll be a whole new form, and it'll be so great that it'll be shown on the big screens, and we'll be movie makers from now on, and our careers will be made. So the movie was this. We'd drive and then we'd go to a place and we'd take LSD and then we'd get out and we'd do stuff and film it.
The marijuana on board was not legal.
One of the reasons they got away with driving across the country, doing illegal drugs and being weird as hell is they had this frat boy college look, and the cops did not know what to think of them.
Most people did not know what to think of them. The travelers always wore red, white, and blue stripes.
These colors looked good on that camera. They interchanged them, so you don't ever see one person wearing the same shirt over and over. Next day, somebody's wearing that hat and somebody else is wearing the shirt you were wearing yesterday.
The oldest person on the bus was the driver, Neil Cassidy, age 40.
Nine, like a cat, exit 9, went over, get up my spine.
A fast-talking, speed-taking holdover from the Beat generation.
Turtle 9, exit 9, slow potion number 9.
Jack Kerouac, in his novel On the Road, had modeled the lead character on Cassidy.
Slow potion number 9.
The trip to New York took about 1 week. The pranksters took a longer, slower route back to La Honda.
When the bus got back, he probably would have gone right back into writing, but nobody wanted to leave. And Ken did all sorts of things. They had goodbye parties. One time they even went so far as to build a bonfire to burn all the kind of costumes they wore on the bus trip. But everybody had bonded so that they just kept coming back.
Well, when we got back from the bus trip, which took all of summer of 1964, we started editing the movie and working on it. But we had a problem.
Much of the film looked a little unsteady, but that was not the problem.
There's a weak spot. Now that weak spot is always attacked by the highest of the next door forces, like second dimension, third dimension, fourth dimension. 5, 4.
Most of the sound had been recorded out of sync with the film and at fluctuating speeds.
It's
I think I know what's going on now. There's a cop behind us. So all week long we would, at Kesey's house in La Honda, we'd edit that stuff. And then on the weekend, on Saturday night, we'd show it. People started showing up. Oh, it got too much. So we decided we're going to have to get out of the house. So we started renting these halls, just small halls where we'd show the movies. And by that time, we had gotten to know these guys, these musicians. They were known as the Warlocks. That's what they called themselves.
The film screenings evolved into multimedia dance parties. This was a new kind of live music production. The Warlocks became the regular band for the gatherings and changed their name to the Grateful Dead.
Then there was lights strobing and colored lights and liquid lights pulsating, and everybody's wearing a costume.
LSD, nicknamed acid, was plentiful at these events, which came to be called acid tests.
Out in the middle of the room would be 2 big tubs of Kool-Aid. One marked this way and one marked that way. And you could choose whether or not you wanted to jump in with both feet or stand on the outside and watch the show. That was their approach. And again, you got to remember this was legal. They weren't thinking they were doing something wrong so much as letting a cat out of a bag.
Most of the LSD was being made by this man, Owsley Stanley. Born into a family of Kentucky politicians, Owsley had served in the Air Force, studied everything from engineering to ballet, and taught himself chemistry. He became the first individual to ever mass-produce LSD, concocting well over 1 million doses. Nearly all of the acid tests took place in California in 1965 and 66. All but one. That was in early '66 in Portland, Oregon, in a building called Beaver Hall.
I remember I had my children with me, so I put a blanket down on the floor and we just kind of made a little camp there. And the Grateful Dead were kind of playing on stage, and people were wandering around. Some were doing little acts and stuff. It was kind of like a fair or something like that. It was kind of fun to sit there and watch. And I remember this one person kind of came in off the street.
He was a businessman. It was in the middle of winter, and he was all dressed up in a suit, and he had an umbrella. It was sleeting rain down at us. He went in, and when it came time to pass around the Kool-Aid, he looked these kids over and thought, I can do what they can do. And about an hour later, you saw him, and his eyes were swimming around in his head, and he happened to see a shadow on the floor, and he says, he looked at the shadow, and he says, "The king walks." And he walks like this, and he put his umbrella over his shoulder. He says, "The king turns around." And he says, "Now the king dances." Pretty soon he was dancing with these little hippie girls, swirling around and having a great time. And I've often wondered what came of this guy.
So at the acid test, all your covers are taken off, see. You become the essential you. And can you stand the essential you, or can you not?
Back in California, Kesey found himself in trouble, arrested and prosecuted for possessing marijuana.
But we were still doing the acid tests, and we were going to go to LA and do them down there. And before we did them, Kesey committed suicide.
Ken Kesey had left a phony suicide note in his parked truck near an ocean cliff.
Drove down to Mexico and went to this little town called Manzanillo and parked the bus, and there was Kesey. Miracle. So we stayed down there for 6 months. Wonderful time on the beach.
Eventually, tired of hiding out in Mexico, Kesey returned to California. He was soon arrested and sentenced for marijuana to 6 months in the San Mateo County Jail. He kept a colorful journal of life on the inside. He documented everything from everyday prison talk to the drama of a near riot. Years later, he would gather the pages together as Kesey's Jail Journal. 4 years after the '64 bus trip, it was vividly recounted in The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test by Tom Wolfe.
Tom Wolfe was never on the bus. He didn't come around until after the bus trip.
He did really good interviews, and he went and listened to all the audio tapes that the pranksters were making and saw all the film. So he got all this great detail, enough so that it seemed like he was there.
When that book came out, it made us kind of the poster children of the '60s and the psychedelic movement.
More than a year of legal troubles and 6 months in jail had taken a toll on Kesey. He no longer fancied himself the wild swashbuckler of Wolfe's book. Yet that would be the Ken Kesey that the rest of the world now expected. Mind-altering drugs had spilled into mainstream society, hand in hand with new music, changing attitudes about sex, and a rejection of conformity. The press anointed it the hippie movement.
You're out if you're not in, a be in, the recurring theme of which is love one another. It's sort of a happy happening for hippies.
The Merry Pranksters had helped pave the way for a new American counterculture.
Permit me to remind you, friends, That the acid test spawned the Great Trips Festival at San Francisco's Longshoremen's Hall in early 1966, and that the Trips Festival begat the Fillmore Auditorium, which begat Woodstock, which begat life as we know it.
But the pranksters themselves had moved on. Ken Kesey and his family came home to Oregon in 1967. As the 60s ended, Kesey began to write a new chapter of his own life. He and Faye bought a small farm just a few miles from where they had grown up. The bus, further, stopped running and would be relegated to the side yard. Ken now drove a tractor.
Our community here have always been very supportive and very nice, very helpful. You know, as we tried to learn to farm, and our cows would get out, and you know, all kinds of things like that.
His family was important to him. His family was very important to him. His kids, his grandkids, his mother and dad.
Ken and Faye had 3 children together, Shannon, Zane, and Jed. Kesey also had another daughter, Sunshine, with another woman in California. After many visits to Oregon, Sunshine moved here to Pleasant Hill.
We actually started a whole kids' camp down in the swamp, and adults were not allowed. And we had our own beds, our own cooking area with a little stove, and even had chickens tied to a tree so we could gather eggs. Every once in a while, my dad would come down late at night and scare the bejesus out of us. You know, just he'd put a cowhide over himself or something and come down there huff-a-lumping along like a scary bear.
Ken Kesey liked kids, and the Kesey farm was, by all accounts, a fun place to be one.
Well, he would be famous for creating legends. And we had these bullfrogs down there, and you'd hear it down there. And he'd tell us, oh, that's legs. You don't want to know about legs. Oh, the last kid that went down there, and he knew how to push buttons on kids.
There was an old irrigation pipe, and one end was hidden behind the cookhouse, and the other end was out in this field, but you could hear all the way through it, but you had no idea where the noise was coming from. And so he marked it as the woozle hole, and whenever anyone would come over, he'd have them go and listen to the woozle hole, and someone would be at the other end, usually him, saying, "Woozle, woozle."
What do you call this?
Family is one of the things that Ken and I had very much in common and was very central to our marriage.
Taylor, I've already put them through there and they're gone. Where are they? Where are they, Taylor? In my nose.
The desire to have a family of our own and to have it be integrated into the rest of our large family.
We all live in a yellow submarine.
Several of the other pranksters now lived nearby.
Establishing a home and a regular life and kids in school and sports, all that stuff and everything. But meanwhile, we still were making movies and still creating a lot of stuff.
We came here to find the trail of Merlin.
Good morning. Yes, this is the Easter Bunny.
When we were in England, Ken and some other people there in England did this little play. It was a children's play, and it was called The Landis Rising. And so we came back here, and he got some of his friends, and then they decided they'd go down to this place that somebody had on the beach in California, and they would try to do it. But the weather wasn't very good, and he had a hard time getting everybody to do their parts.
In the mid-70s, Kesey organized 2 performing arts events at the University of Oregon. He called them poetic hoo-haws.
I want to be an old maid. I'm a strawberry man. I'm a Chinaman. I'm a railroad train.
None of those rides where you twist and turn and spin round and round till you don't know anymore where you began. No, I ain't going on no rides with no gentleman, no sir.
What's your name? Repetition to love, match point to me. What do you think you are? Rhetoric, game, and match. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Our lead warrior in the battle against the enemies in the Third World War, which is going on in the space between ourselves, William S. Burroughs. Give him a big hand.
When did I stop wanting to be president? At birth, certainly, and perhaps before.
Once in a while on a weekend, you'd suddenly end up with all kinds of people coming, wanting to see the bus, wanting to see Ken. And he tried to deal with all of that to the best of his ability.
Sometimes a Great Notion is 1964. He doesn't publish another novel for quite some time.
Where is it, Ken? Where's the next great novel? Where's this and that?
Muskrat, muskrat, what makes you smell so bad? I've been living in the mud so dead-gum long, it's a wonder I ain't dead, I ain't dead, I ain't dead.
As a writer, you do a book and then you want to move on to something else that's interesting.
Kesey was writing, mostly at night.
I don't die, I don't die, I don't die. Muskrat, muskrat, makes your hair so slick. Bad? Smells so bad, that's what it is.
Outside of Oregon, few people paid much attention to Kesey's new lifestyle. But his first 2 novels continued to sell. Both were rewritten for the stage, then produced as major motion pictures. In the summer of 1970, a Hollywood movie crew came to the Oregon coast to film Sometimes a Great Notion. The people of Newport and other nearby towns enjoyed hosting Paul Newman, Henry Fonda, and Lee Remick. The movie makers made Kesey welcome on the set, even when it was closed to the rest of the public. In 1974, at the State Hospital in Salem, production began on One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Kesey feuded with the producers of this film. He eventually sued them over some contractual issues. Cuckoo's Nest was a box office hit and swept the 1976 Academy Awards. It won all 5 of the top categories. Kesey never did see the movie.
Here he is now, famous Jud Kesey. Well, Jud Kesey, may I ask what your position is in this dead weekend?
Spectator.
Jed was always, you'd even say Dad's favorite.
Some idea. Here's my keg. I have Hagen come over here and give his opinion.
For me, he was always a best friend that, I spent more time with him than really I did with any of my parents or anybody else.
Here are some selections from the Pleasant Hill High School 1978-79 wrestling season. We'll take you over to Zane, who will point out the pictures while I go flick the slide projector.
As a 3-year-old, Ken's son, Jed, had been badly injured when a train hit the car his father was driving.
He sighed, a curious, familiar sigh, though I'd never heard another like it before. And I felt the life go out of him, as though that soft sound were wings assigned to bear its essence gently away. My ear found no beating at his chest. Oh, dear Lord, please don't let him die.
Bring him over, Jed, bring him over.
Ken had managed to resuscitate his son, and Jed grew up.
I totally adored my brother. He was really easygoing and real sweet person, and just gentle.
Have you ever lost a child? Well, no matter how old they get, they're still your child. And it hurts all the way down to the bottom.
In 1984, at age 20, Jed was fatally injured, along with another member of the University of Oregon wrestling team, when the team's van crashed on the way to a meet. The family gathered at the hospital.
Now we could see him trying, fighting. We could see it in his clenched fists, his threshing legs. And then, Jesus, we saw it in his face. The quick flicker back of consciousness, the awful hurt being realized, the tears saying, I don't think I can do her this time, Dad. I'm sorry. I truly am. And everybody said, it's okay, old Jetterdink. You know better than we do. Breathe easy. Go on ahead.
It was just so devastating to all of us. And Ken just had such a hard time. He loved his children so much, and they were such a big part of his life.
Thank you very much. May I have another one?
But I think partly because of our relationship to all our family and friends, they just helped us to get through it.
In 1986, Kesey published a collection of articles and essays called Demon Box. In it, he reflected on the deaths of Neil Cassidy and John Lennon.
It took a long time for him to sort of get back in the saddle. But once he did get back in the saddle, he really did.
Time as a prankster, what was the best thing that ever happened? And I thought about it for a while, and I said, well, I don't know, it's not over.
Further had sat in the yard for nearly 20 years. Kesey now towed it to a new resting place in the swamp. Further, too, had arrived. And Ken Kesey was back. This time, skilled artists painted the bus. The metal trim got chromed. The interior was outfitted with a sound system and a short-range radio transmitter. A rumor circulated that this was the original bus, fixed up to be donated to the Smithsonian. Kesey did little to quell the misperception. He'd even had some hand in starting it. Regardless, he never seemed to distinguish much between Furthers 1 and 2.
You know, it's just metal and paint. The bus itself is a spirit that goes on whether the bus is there or not. It's like trigger. There's just one trigger, even though there may have been other horses. In the same way, there's just one bus.
It was like a performance art that you could kind of repeat in different variations all the time. So I think he thought of it in that way as a very creative project. He didn't know of anybody else who had ever done anything quite like it.
This time, when the bus hit the road, the destination was usually a rock festival, a celebration, or a parade.
You know who that is on top? Hi, Ken.
Further had always attracted attention, but now it seemed to represent something, a bygone era, an optimistic time.
An age when everything and anything seemed not merely possible, but likely. In 1964, Ken reminds us, we were young people trying to turn on the old. Now we're old people trying to turn on the young.
On a trip to Portland for a book signing, the bus drew a crowd nearly as big as the line inside for the author. As the years passed, the national media turned to Kesey as a spokesman for the 60s.
Do you feel that you may have hurt yourself at all from all the experiments or experiences that you've had?
No.
The press had anointed him father of the counterculture.
We're the John Waynes of LSD. We've done all the right stuff. We don't hit our wives. We don't molest the kids. We try to keep the land well. We're nice to dogs. And at some point, that's going to have to count.
He spoke openly against the violence in film and television. He contended that children spend too much time passively staring at gadgets and not enough time doing things.
The Eugene Public Library could get him to come fairly easily if they mentioned it was for children. I remember going to one of his events in which it was about Sesame Street, and Sesame Street was the great reading tool of the day, but he went off in the opposite direction, said Sesame Street was the wrong direction to go in, that it blurred the distinction between brought to you by the letter L and the actual content, and really the kids needed books. And he pointed around to all the books that were there.
Well, ma'am, I'm Big Double.
Kesey loved stories. He would tell over and over the tale of Little Tricker the Squirrel meets Big Double the Bear, a story he'd learned as a child from his grandmother.
And right then, it cut loose again. Shaking in the cottonwood from root to crown till the critter could hardly stand. It was a bear. A grizzly bear. And then out goes...
Kesey saw himself as a jester. The jester who gets to comment on the king's politics. The jester who gets to say things other people don't.
I couldn't get up in front of an audience right now in my hometown and talk this stuff because I would have NRA guys booing me and women who were married to these NRA guys with foam at the edges of their mouth trying to chew on my legs.
Since childhood, Kesey's favorite platform for self-expression had always been the stage.
He loved the idea of costume and gesture. Let's turn up the lights and put on clown faces and traipse around the neighborhood and blow horns. And so that's the sense of his energy that I get.
He based his play Twister loosely on The Wizard of Oz, and on the idea that in times of catastrophe, people reach out to help each other.
My foolish heart, it loves not wisely, but too much.
Dorothy and the Tin Man and Elvis and the Scarecrow and Frankenstein.
Ken Kesey's 1992 novel Sailor Song was his first in 28 years. It received mixed reviews. Critics compared it to his first two novels, and that was a contest Sailor Song could never win. His next novel, a collaboration with Ken Babbs, turned out to be Kesey's last. Fittingly named The Last Go-Around, the story takes place in the early days of the Pendleton Roundup.
Bulldogging never was my favorite event, but I was disgusted enough to get reckless. I gave a rebel yell the moment my steer churned into sight. The barrier rope dropped, and I took after him like hell boiling over.
Kesey and Babbs finally did finish the bus film more than 30 years after the trip.
We will be doing as best we can to bring you tonight's episode of the Merry Pranksters Look for a Cool Place. Off in the distance, Ken Kesey himself, the purchaser of the 1939 International Harvester.
The other camera with the zoom lens also mounted on a tripod.
It never hit the big screens, nor did it establish the men as top movie makers.
Stop! Stop! Hold it!
But they did sell thousands of videotape copies in covers of their own design.
He wanted us to feel the drama and the magnificence of things and expanding your mind and seeing what we're all here for. What's the purpose of all this? and how do we have fun with it.
Kesey was diabetic. He had a stroke in 1997. Throughout the late 90s, he was slowing down and tiring easily. He developed liver cancer, and in November 2001, Ken Kesey died of complications following surgery. He was 66 years old. He and his band of merry friends had ridden the crest of the wave that crashed through the 1960s and changed the way we think. He also wrote 2 of the 20th century's great American novels.
Well, he was just a great son. There was times when I loved him dearly, and there was times when I could have kicked his butt into crystals. So there you are.
On the original bus trip, they got stuck in Arizona, and it was hotter than hell, and they decided, okay, the bus is stuck here. Let's all take a bunch of acid. And eventually, they found the little paints that they kept in the back of the bus. And they started dripping the paints into the mud puddles out there and swirling around the colors and swirling around the colors. And then finally they dipped Zonker's t-shirt into there. And that was the first sort of marmalized, hippie, tie-dyed t-shirt that they discovered how to do.
What do you think?
Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote that to be yourself in a world that's constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment.
Emerson says we are here to have an original relationship with the universe. I think Kesey does that. I think he does that.
Jed Kesey had been laid to rest on the family farm. His father, Ken, is buried just a few feet away.
As Dad says, you only get one ticket on this ride. There's no sense in sitting and watching the ride go by.
There's more about Ken Kesey at Oregon Experience Online. To learn more or to order a DVD of the show, visit opb.org. Funding for Oregon Experience is provided by the Robert D. and Marcia H. Randall Fund for Lifelong Learning, the Oregon Cultural Trust, the Clark Foundation, additional support provided by the Roundhouse Foundation, and viewers like you. Thank you.